All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making the time to be here. It's such a hard time in the semester, and so it's wonderful to see so many influential people in this space. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nadia Omer. I'm a professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the Koch Institute for International Peace Studies, Keough School, and I have the great pleasure to introduce this event, the speaker for today. This event is co-sponsored by the Unlearning Modernities program at the Koch Institute and also by the Nationalism Institute. So it's such a wonderful pleasure to have an opportunity to collaborate. So thank you, Professor Simon, because I'm also speaking in my capacity as a co-director of the Contemporary Modernities program. So I have the great pleasure to introduce to you Professor John Rees, who is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Notre, Australia, where he is co-convener of the Religion and Global Ethics program at the Institute for Ethics and Society. This is Dr. Rees' first visit to the University of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame.
Yeah, Notre Dame.
So the opportunity really emerged because Dr. Rees is currently a Fulbright professor at the University of Wyoming. So that was just an opportunity to pass. Professor Rees is a recognized scholar of religion in the field of international relations, a field that needs a lot more of religious literacy, which is partly what he'll be talking about today. And the title of his talk is Beyond the West, Nationalism, Religious Literacy, and the War in Ukraine. So very timely. Thank you so much for coming here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Rees.
Thank you, Natalia, and good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Week 15 universally is busy, and so I sincerely appreciate your time. I'm grateful to Professor Natalia Omer and colleagues at the Contending Modernities program for this invitation, and to the sponsors of this event, the Koch Institute for International Peace Studies and the Nationalism Institute for European Studies. I am indebted to many here at Notre Dame for influencing my thought over 2 decades. Principal among these is Dean Professor R. Scott Appleby. Thank you, sir, for your work and for your legacy. I thank the University of Wyoming and the Fulbright Commission for the opportunity to be here in the United States. I send greetings from the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and its Vice Chancellor, Professor Francis Campbell. I acknowledge the First Nations peoples upon whose lands we meet today, and the sacred traditions upon which this university was founded. It's truly an honor to be here speaking today, albeit on a very sober topic. The war in Ukraine, beyond Western framing. In the weeks leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a campaign begun in 2014 and escalated with criminal brutality on February 24 this year. Many in the West began thinking about the political and social makeup of the Ukrainian nation for the first time. For millions, the New York Times flagship podcast, The Daily, became a place to hear expert analysis and reportage on the war in Ukraine, interwoven with explanations of history and place in ways that are brief, digestible, accessible. For instance, the episode of February 15, How Ukrainians View This Perilous Moment, arranged a suite of powerful personal stories told from the capital Kyiv and several regional contexts into a narrative challenging President Putin's assumptions about Ukrainian submission to the looming Russian takeover. How insightful such a report proved to be. Since the 2022 invasion, the refrain Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, has evoked images of defiance in the face of tyranny, national sacrifice in the struggle against oppression, and hope and despair on the outer edges of catastrophe. The magnitude of Western solidarity with Ukraine, both its military and humanitarian expressions, can arguably be explained by both the moral gravity and existential proximity of the conflict, embodied in the circumstances of civilians as collateral victims and strategic targets of Russian aggression. Of equal significance, I suggest, is the translatability of the Ukrainian resistance into the idioms of Western liberalism. In particular, the discursive superstructure of democracy versus autocracy that situates the war in Ukraine in a Manichaean world, pitting the struggle for freedom against the demagogic intentions of a tyrant. The name of Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has become universally associated with democratic liberty, much as the names of others before him in different times and places. Indeed, the tallest mountain in my homeland of Australia was given its colonial name in 1840 in honor of Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a Polish-Lithuanian freedom fighter. If the mountain were renamed today, notwithstanding its indigenous place name currently being negotiated among Aboriginal nations in the area, it would no doubt be as Mount Zelensky. Such inspiring dynamics of solidarity making are clearly welcome, especially as a sustained humanitarian response by the West toward millions of Ukrainian refugees will no doubt be required. Yet we are also provoked to ask what may be lost in translating the Ukrainian resistance through the discursive filter of democracy versus autocracy, and why this might impact the nature of our solidarity, as well as long-term prospects for peace. How might the fight be reimagined beyond Westernism and beyond Western interests? And how might this reimagining thicken our understanding of democracy and the resources that inform it? I return my thoughts to The Daily, the world-leading investigative podcast that also offers a portal into the liberal worldview, and arguably the best form of it. As its millions of followers would attest, The Daily is nothing if not highly scripted, tightly produced around dramatic pauses, metered interjections, the juxtaposition of serious content with tiptoe curiosity soundbites, and the communication of mature and insightful analysis in tension with a kind of explainer baby talk where the listener is simultaneously informed and infantilized. The movement between these experiences, I suggest, mirrors liberalism itself, notably its nimble capacity to simplify collective phenomena for individual understanding via a reductively thin rendering of social space. In this context, what is left out of a story is just as important as what is put in. The Heavenly Hundred: religion, the sacred, and national belonging. The initial encounter in the episode of February 15 illustrates this dynamic. The report first visits a memorial site in Kyiv to 100 plus people, remembered as the Heavenly Hundred, who were killed in the uprising that began in late 2015, known as both the Maidan Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity. Describing the site as this black steel and granite monument with these kind of spectral faces taken from real life photos of individuals, unquote, the report accurately depicts the memorial as dedicated to a tipping point event in the modern history of the Ukrainian nation, whose victims are lauded as heroes for the principles of democracy, human rights, and freedoms. The podcast narrative twice emphasizes the fallen as individuals who collectively, quote, through the force of numbers, through the force of their own will, unquote, overthrew the autocratic regime of President Viktor Yanukovych. Adding to the narrative is an encounter with, and I quote, two elderly women there in scarves, cleaning up the site, unquote. As a final comment, the reporter conveys an explanation from one of the women about her actions. He says, every time one of the individuals who died during the uprising in 2014 has a birthday, she hangs their photos on a little holder here and rings a bell. End of scene. The underlying emphasis of this brief account is one of civic defiance, of spontaneous ritualized choices by individual citizens, depicted later in the report as, quote, college students and history professors, unquote, joining volunteer brigades to fight the Russian incursion into eastern Ukraine. Now, few would doubt the inspiration of such citizen courage. But as an educative process of describing the dynamics of resistance in Ukraine, of helping listeners in the United States, Australia, and elsewhere to enter a social and political space very different from their own, to understand, as the episode's title suggests, how Ukrainians view this perilous moment, the Daily's account at the Memorial of the Heavenly Hundred is deficient in important ways. Such a criticism might seem unfair in light of the need to produce a fast-moving podcast, were it not that the missing elements in the story are also absent from all Daily reportage to date. Again, what is left out is as instructive as what is put in. The elements to which I refer are those of religion and nationalism as formative resources of communal and institutional resistance to Russian aggression. Not coincidentally, I suggest, dynamics such as these also disrupt the ideological scripts of Western liberalism. The daily scene at the Memorial of the Heavenly Hundred begins near what the reporter describes as a small wooden chapel. Such a detail provokes us to interrogate the religious aspects of the site, whether they are a central or ancillary dimension, and an original or a later addition to the lived practices of remembrance that occur there. In an essay titled Commemoration and the New Frontiers of War in Ukraine, the scholar Catherine Wanner offers an incisive answer. I quote, a popular outpouring of grief over the deaths of protesters in February 2014 resulted in individuals creating vernacular memorial shrines, sometimes in the form of graves, to honor those killed. From the beginning, a prominent religious idiom was incorporated into commemorations as it was in the protests themselves. Candles, icons, and prayer beads, perhaps bells, which evoke the veneration of saints, are among the other objects with clear religious meaning that are placed near the shrines. In 2014, I was invited to write about the place of religion in the Maidan Revolution and was immediately confronted by how to interpret powerful images of Orthodox priests placing themselves at the deadly center of the protests. Actions that added a more traditionally sacral dimension to the events that preceded the vernacular rituals of the post-revolution memorials. Functioning as a corrective to my initial interpretation that religion was indeed ancillary to the more primary factors of economic and democratic autonomy, and that these priests had less agency, for instance, than in the earlier communist struggles in Poland. Wanner attributes both vernacular and institutional forms of religion with a primary role. In 2017, she writes, the exterior wall of St. Michael's Monastery in downtown Kyiv, where the protesters notably took refuge during the Maidan protests, became a site of a wall of remembrance for those fallen in Ukraine. The notable presence of clergy during the protests gave way to a rapid expansion of the number of military chaplains who accompanied soldiers to the east. The Australian Stefan Romaniuk, the first vice president of the Ukrainian World Congress and a participant in the Revolution of Dignity, recalls the coexistence of ecclesiastical leadership and the primacy of grassroots activism at work at Maidan. He writes, "I recall the street rallies. Many hundreds of thousands of people started at Taras Shevchenko National University and marched to Maidan. I remember Patriarch Lubomir Husar, Patriarch of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, in an open vehicle speaking to the crowd. Over the course of the revolution, politicians took to the stage, but slowly realized that this was a civil revolution, a people's movement. Civil society took charge." For scholars seeking to reinstate religious actors' interests and practices within the political landscape, the reframing of the Revolution of Dignity through the lens of vernacular and formal religious expressions would constitute an important finding. Such a reframing, to be sure, represents an advance in religious literacy applied to the Ukrainian struggle because we see something thicker, more culturally embedded in the modes of Ukrainian descent, as much supported by the human recognition of presences traditionally and adaptively conceived beyond the temporal order, as motivated by issues of material justice within it, and much less of the autonomous citizen self as the sole occupant and hero of thinner liberal narratives. Yet the fusion of religion and national resistance could also be a legitimate cause for concern when applying perspectives more aligned with critical disciplines, such as the contribution of religious scholar Diane Moore, which require religious literacy to include, and I quote Professor Moore, an analysis of power and powerlessness. And again, the question, which perspectives are politically and socially prominent and why? Whatever roles history professors might have played, we do know for certain that the Maidan Revolution was comprised of a variety of actors with a variety of interests, from the liberal intelligentsia, quoting Pinkham, to hardcore nationalists. The spectre of a religious nationalism with strong affinities toward national chauvinism, therefore, creates interpretive dilemmas for understanding how some Ukrainians indeed view this perilous moment. As Wenner observes, religious institutions have tremendous political valence because of their ability to create and morally legitimate new cultural boundaries and the often unsavory emotions that lead to delineations of us and them. Many supporters of the Maidan validate religiosity as a fundamental component of Ukrainian nationality, unquote. So we must ask, nationality for whom? Might religio-nationalist resolve not only galvanize resistance, but also unlock historical legacies of social hostility towards religious minorities in Ukraine, including an increasing number holding to no religion? Critical approaches face a dilemma here. The recognition that religion has always been involved in the world of power, I quote Professor Talal Assad there, has caused many to erase it as the mere epiphenomena of hegemonic structural interests, an inverted form of the modern liberal containment of religion as the mere expression of individualized ethics. In a departure from both approaches and in solidarity with the scholarly tradition that wants to ask critical questions in and through religious beliefs, practices, and belongings, in what follows, I suggest the legacies of religion in the war in Ukraine offer frameworks for understanding the broader constitutive forces of nationhood beyond Western assumptions and a political hermeneutic guided by the frame of autocracy, democracy. Glory to Ukraine, religion and the ideal type of a sacred nation. Before progressing, it's important to briefly declare some of my assumptions. I understand the state to be a bureaucratic entity, and as a scholar more aligned to ethno-symbolic theories of nationalism, I part ways with modernist scholars of both a cosmopolitan and critical persuasion who assume that it is the state that creates the nation. Whilst acknowledging the brilliant insights of a modernist like Sinisa Milešević, that states can powerfully mobilize nationalist sentiment via institutions, ideology, and networks of micro-solidarity, I also hold Benedict Anderson's popular modernist idea of the nation as an imagined community to be far too anemic. To echo the writings of Anthony Smith, nations are not only imagined, they are willed, felt, remembered, and repurposed. And the deep cultural reservoirs from which such actions are often drawn predate the state and in some instances give rise to it. While states differ in polity and efficiency, the long-held critical axiom that states see a certain way has an enduring salience. In classical terms, the state is more of a Parmenidean entity, defined by unity, where all movement ultimately serves the one. By contrast, whilst different nations can be understood against similar sets of ideals and concepts, the processes of their formation are both varied and dynamic. Thus, the nation is more of a Heraclitean entity, defined by movement and the possibility that the flows of history will constantly yield new iterations at once recognizable and reconfigured. Well, with these distinctions between state and nation in mind, I shall now return to the complex issue of religion and national belonging in the context of the war in Ukraine. In many contexts around the world, the state asserts religion as an archetype, as a first form, indispensable to the reinforcement of a patriotic standard or canon. The principal example of religion as archetype in our present moment is the Russian Orthodox Church, or the ROC, and its relationship with the Russian state. In an important essay, Shakhanova and Krotokville examined the patriotic turn of the ROC via the discursive movements of nomination, naming key actors and concepts, predication, assigning value to actors and actions against a patriotic standard, and argumentation, the construction of a persuasive narrative, leading to the creation of key rhetorical topoi that are employed in the discourse of Russian education and politics. Relevant to our notion of religion as archetype, in the realm of education, the topos of indispensability, whereby the church, as the only one who can protect Russia from moral decadence, develops into a topos of superiority, orthodox patriotism as superior to all other kinds. In the realm of church cooperation and state, the topos of moral supremacy, the church's moral tutelage of the state, develops into the topos of power struggle, Orthodox Christians having to be influential in politics. Religion as archetype is also seen in the author's appeal to a 2014 study by M.D. Suslov on the creation of the idea of Holy Rus. They write, in this interpretation, the church constructs collective identity based on the Orthodox faith, the Russian language, and historical memory, according to which Russia retains a central position, whether in Eurasia, in a Slavic union, or in Orthodox Christian civilization, unquote. Here, the archetype first form is violently imposed upon a geopolitical space, as forecast in President Putin's now infamous essay of July 12, 2021, titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." Whereas the state asserts religion as an archetype, the nation enables religion as an ideal type. That is, as a construct into which multiple meanings can be situated and enacted. A hermeneutic of possibility thus exists, whereby a national ontology can be partially and sometimes significantly informed by the beliefs, traditions, and practices of those religions present in society, both in their intra-communal particularity and their interfaith solidarities. As ideal types, these religious forms can interact with broader normative agendas in the construction of civil and political cultures of inclusion. All such features, I suggest, can be found in the ideational texture of the recent statement, a declaration on the Russian world, Ruski Mir, teaching, by an international network of Orthodox scholars, clergy, and lay people against Russian ideology. First, the primary appeal is to interpretive practices of the Orthodox faith, notably the ethics that stem from situated readings of sacred text. Second, the affirmation of human equality, that is, beyond confessional and partisan boundaries, is framed as a prophetic challenge to, and I quote, all forms of government that deify the state, unquote. Third, that a turning away, a metanoia, from the current conflict is also a turning toward the unity of the spirit in the bond of peace, quoting the text. The sentiments of the declaration were echoed in a statement of solidarity against Christian nationalism, signed by an international coalition of scholars, many theologians, instigated by a conference at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University just recently. The tablet reports a detail from the conference that is relevant to our notion of religion as ideal type. At a public lecture during the conference, Archimandrite Cyril Overin encouraged Orthodox theologians to weaken symphonia with the state and strengthen symphonia with civil society. The Ukrainian priest and academic used the metaphor of symphonia or musical unison to describe Orthodoxy's relationship with the polity, unquote. Religion understood as both distinct yet malleable communal practices and a metaphor for civic unity encapsulates well the potential of religions as ideal types in the service of the common good, the challenge to hegemonic injustice, and the building of nations. John Keane, political theorist and biographer of former Czech President Václav Havel, conceives of civil society as an ideal type that, and I quote, both describes and envisages the complex and dynamic ensemble of legally protected non-government institutions that tend to be non-violent, self-reflexive, and permanently in tension with each other and with the state institutions that frame, constrict, and enable their activities, unquote. Notably, Keane argues that in some contexts, civil societies are best nurtured and protected by renewing religious faith and can pose a challenge to political despotism. Latent within Father Cyril Overin's appeal for a symphonia with civil society is a rejection of the archetype of the religio state. He elsewhere, in another interview, appeals to the condemnation of philotism, nationalism applied to ecclesiastical affairs at the Council of Constantinople in 1872, in favour of a preferential option for the plural nation. In the case of Russia's war on Ukraine, we are arguably presented with the geopolitical adaptation of R. Scott Appleby's seminal and enduring concept of the ambivalence of the sacred. On the one side, Holy Russia, founded on the archetype of a singular religio-political ontology. On the other, the Ukrainian nation, in a resistance struggle understood by its citizens to be contextually and metaphorically sacred. The national exaltation of the Heavenly Hundred memorializes the revolution by infusing this sacredness throughout the Ukrainian resistance. The advocacy of traditional hierarchs, religious and civic, on behalf of an oppressed and endangered nation, and the accountability of those same hierarchs to the standards of sacred justice believed in traditional and vernacular ways by a citizen community. For the Ukrainian nation, therefore, the bifurcated discourse of autocracy versus democracy does not do justice to all that is at play in the circumstances of this terrible moment, nor to the multi-layered and situated meanings of the refrain, "Glory to Ukraine." The dynamics of religion and nation are inextricably entangled in the scenarios that will unfold in the coming months and years, not only for Ukrainians, but also for Russians. To not acknowledge those dynamics presents a serious deficiency in our understanding and in our solidarity. When an elderly woman whose history is intimately bound up in the story of both peoples rings a bell at a grave of the fallen, it is unlikely that she intends to channel the powers of modern liberal individualism to her cause. It is instead more reasonable to assume that she is releasing a sound that reverberates through spaces that are as primordial as modern, linked to communities both in the present and the past, and ritualized in the hope that the sustaining presences of sacred social order will one day give rise to a renewed and better life for her people. Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was excellent. I'd like to talk about violence in these competing nationalisms, religious nationalisms in Russia and Ukraine. I appreciate the invocation of the ambivalence concept. And in that setting, the ambivalence was also understanding, perceiving the sacred as the source of both healing, reconciliation, and in some circumstances, deadly violence. Do you have insight into the ways in which these two competing nationalisms legitimate, justify, resist violence as part of the sacralization of the nation? Under what, I know this is a broad question and it varies. So I suppose we would begin with the leadership. It is always stunning to me, that I'm not naive about it, it's nonetheless stunning how readily and easily deadly violence, indiscriminate violence, violence against non-combatants seems to be, if not sacralized by patriarchs in this case, accepted, accommodated. What insight do you have into that? Is there any sense of ambivalence in the leadership, and then on the broader cultural level with people who are at shrines like this?
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. It's an important question, and actually one that has slightly obsessed me over the last couple of years, because I think in our analysis, for a variety of reasons, and some very understandable and empirically valid reasons, we have separated the institutional from the so-called lived. And I think that a difference of terms that I've become more comfortable with is formal and vernacular, because institutional and lived, has become really loaded with a priori assumptions about the malign nature of institutions and the virtue of lived practices. I had always wondered whether that was satisfactory and at work on the ground. And I find the best example of this being Pope Francis, whose first foreign policy act was to go to the island of Lampedusa and enact a penitential mass. And the altar, in a very vernacular way, is constructed for those whose boats had smashed and whose lives had passed. But the formality and the institutional practices were also infused with the moment. One could not separate. In many other occasions, and hence Father Overend's comments, as a priest, appealing to the pivot of what the church should do institutionally, not just in a lived vernacular way. So both formally and through practice. So my answer to the question, I think, is that questions of legitimizing violence or strategies for peace occur in domains that are both institutionally formed and lived in practice. Scott Hibbard's work is important here on closed and open ideologies. I believe that the way forward in thinking about these issues is to not cut away the institutional, but to see the institutional as very strongly a player, not only in hegemonic control, but also in liberative action. And so we see this at work within the Orthodox Church. There is a war of political theologies within Orthodoxy. We can see it in these statements. And these are both institutional and lived on both sides. So I don't know if that answers the question entirely, but I think analytically, that's where I've moved in helping myself at least to try and think through some of those issues. Does that satisfy your inquiry?
Professor Steinbeck, I defer to him and I'll come back.
No, follow up.
Well, so just one, thank you. Idolatry is, I'm sorry, my ignorance of Russian Orthodoxy Ukraine is very limited. But religious nationalism seems to me to pose the biggest challenge for Jews and Christians, at least the first commandment, if I remember my commandments, in which the nation becomes not only sacralized but divinized, and that justifies, legitimates. I mean, we do this in the West as well. I mean, we do this in a so-called secular arena in this country. So I'm not isolating this too. But it becomes particularly bitter to accept, as it were, when the prophetic dimensions of religion that I hesitate to be so blunt about this, that seem to have been that seem to be already jeopardized by Orthodoxy's close relationship to the state historically. But it seems to be very minimal. Again, I don't know the situation. Minimal prophetic voices, at least here. There are some in the U.S. context and Christianity in this context. There are consistent Christian witnesses on both levels you're talking, the institutional, and the vernacular, or the popular. There's at least a protest that this is not our Christian faith. To the contrary, Jesus is the non-violent, etc. And I don't, again, partly ignorance, but I don't see that prophetic voice, that dissenting voice on either side of this divide. And it may well be because it's obscure to us, and this is your entire frame, westernizing this conflict. So is there a presence, is there a voice in which there's a real deep ambivalence, and there's ambivalence on the other side as well?
Yes.
What's that voice? And is the ecclesial structure, the ecclesiology of Orthodoxy, I don't want to call that in question, but just exacerbates the problem. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think one of the reasons why I remain in international relations is this vibrant focus on multi-actedness and also transnationality. And I think the one answer where the prophetic, but also the priestly, this is some other aspects of my work, I would actually argue as metaphors, both the prophetic and the priestly belong in a progressive polity. Prophets can actually be destructive forces in their own right, if not having geared towards, say, for example, theologies of hope, where the prophetic voice simply becomes contrarian. And so this more sort of holistic appeal, I think, must be located within transnational communities of religion and can't simply be, encased in the state. And this is where actually I see a productive conversation, again, as a respectful outsider to the Orthodox tradition and traditions, occurring at a transnational level. There seems to be a reckoning within orthodoxies around the role of governing authority and ecclesiology within these conversations of humanitarian justice and democracy. In my critique of autocracy, democracy, I'm not at all arguing for autocracy or trying to dilute the notion of democracy, but actually trying to thicken it. And my starting assumption is that in there, in that cultural texture that is not my own, orthodoxy, Archbishop Callistos Ware, Anthony Ware, famously said that, orthodoxy is not simply Catholicism without the Pope. It's an entirely different symbolic world. And my starting point in entering that world is that there are institutional and communal possibilities of justice there, latent within it. And I can actually see this in the language of Civil Overon and his appeal to tradition. Again, he doesn't stand outside the resources of his tradition. He appeals to the Council of Constantinople in 1872. He appeals to the pivot towards civil society in a larger society-focused rather than power-centered sense. This very violent discursive push against Ruski Mir is significant for me. It must be based on something deep and abiding. At least that's my starting assumption. I guess it's a hermeneutic of generosity toward the tradition to actually see how it bears out some of those questions, but I can see that.
Yeah, thank you, John. These are big questions. I have a small question. My small question is, during the Stations of the Cross, Rome, Good Friday, Colosseum, there was this one particular scene where they had a Russian and a Ukrainian woman carry the cross together. And there was a heated debate, especially in Ukraine, and a boycott of the communication. And my question is, since you use religious literacy, do you think that the scriptwriter of this choreography lacked religious literacy, or the Ukrainians who critiqued this idea lacked religious literacy? Or to put it bluntly, do you think the decision was wrong, given your understanding of Christianity?
It's a wonderful question, thank you. I think that rituals can be made and remade. They are right from the start, the very images we use in the Stations of the Cross, the very images that we use of the crucified Christ. They are remakings, and they're constantly remakings. Liberative discourses remake them again. And so I think the attempt to do something of a reconciliatory nature is not extraordinary. I think that's right in the wheelhouse of how rituals are enacted and reenacted. And I actually think that I would be on the side of the architect of the ritual rather than of his or her critics, principally because the encasement of that ritual into nationalities rather than across boundaries would be antithetical, I would argue, to the very theological impulse of the ritual itself. And so, as controversial as it would be, I think it's, if you like, and I say this very respectfully, I think it's offending the right people because it's offending a partisan impulse against a more universal impulse.
I'll return to I guess a big question. So you may know that you are competing now with another big lecture. Condoleezza Rice is speaking now with Father John, vehemently opposing the idea of invading a foreign country and installing a friendly government. And I mean, it's really intriguing for me. But I guess I'm thinking about that competing lecture and the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the ideological premise of that invasion, the clash of civilizations, and reading the New York Times and looking at the discourse, the Western discourse that you critique. I'm thinking about a return to a civilizational discourse, but perhaps with different boundaries. The boundaries have shifted a little bit. And I just wonder if you have thought about that, if you can share with us your own thinking about discourse about this the civilizational struggle that may have shifted a little bit in light of the 2003 discourse about clash of civilizations and the justification of the invasion in 2000.
Thank you.
And for those of you who are not at that lecture, thank you very much.
I think no, thank you.
For those of you among you here who are not at this.
Thank you. I should say, as a footnote, I teach religion and world politics, and one of the more productive conversations I've had recently is taking students to that component of Huntington's original essay, where he draws a boundary between the West and the Orthodox world, split down the middle in Ukraine.
Right.
And so there's a kind of site of analysis there where we can both try and listen to what the theory is trying to say, and then to see its weaknesses, now knowing because of the very porous boundary of that hard line that was originally drawn. Nothing is more porous than the boundaries of a civilization. And so there's a sense of, there's a lubricating effect that I think thinking about these actors and these entities not through a securitized framework. Huntington says very little about religion. It's just a security framework. These are black boxes that bump against one another in a very sort of quasi-realist way. And so I would say that what the terrible events in Ukraine are showing us is that the frameworks of resistance to the other side in what is a zero-sum fight in a security space, the resources upon which that resistance is drawn, and I guess the motivation for my paper, aren't cleanly and neatly divorced from the same resources that are on the other side, that there are familial resemblances, there are resources that are ambivalent, I think, being co-opted, both for good and for ill, both for violence and for peacemaking or for resistance. And I think this is strategically a very important point when the war is over. However it ends, and it may end very terribly, as it has already for millions. But when it ends, those same resources, I think, have a role in peace building and reconstruction. None of that is civilizational in nature. I think it's about moving pieces around the board, these resources, and their orientation either towards peace or violence, which is the better framework that I'm trying to enact. And I hope that answers your question. It's a very big and important question, actually. I've taken a few notes and I will go away and think more about that.
I mean, I think when you read the New York Times and you read Western interpretations of what is happening in Ukraine, you see a civilizational discourse that does not rely on religion, but relies on security.
Yes, yeah.
But those issues are very interconnected because, of course, you don't have the impactfulness of the clash discourse, which, of course, Huntington did not invent, he just popularized in the right moment. If you can understand the invasion to Iraq and the war on terrorism and the post-9/11 without understanding the Cold War and without understanding how religion participated in the Cold War and how the consolidation of this notion that somehow Christianity and democracy are one and the same, that Christianity is the root of democracy, this Christian democracy concept. This is where you need to go to the Cold War. And so in many respects, we still need to think about the Cold War. Obviously, yes, Russia, but in different ways, understand it through, it's not a shift, but it's a kind of, I mean, obviously there are shifts, but it's related to one, there is depth there. It's not that all of a sudden there are new variables that and are retooling. Yeah, and there is so much now scholarship on religion in the Cold War, that historical research is very interesting.
Yeah, just to add on that, back on the question is that the Soviet Union was referred to as evil empire, right?
Yeah.
So the language of, even within the secular frame, the idioms were deeply kind of religious, just to add on to what Asher had said. So thank you very much, John, for this great talk. I want to go back to that slide where you have of this conversation in Oxford, where this one, what's his name? So
Cyril Overton, yeah.
So, so just to answer, he's the Russian Orthodox. He's
Ukrainian Orthodox.
Ukrainian Orthodox. Now the question is, when you said, you made this comment that there's a war of political theologies. And when you said political theologies, I jumped at it because I want to learn more about. So how are you in a position to talk more about how the Russian Orthodox Church is framing this war, or what is how do they understand their political theological? Because I think, I mean, as most of us who read the newspapers know, that Putin has in many ways interacted with and you showed the picture there, and there's a deep connection. So how do we now see this kind of clash of orthodoxies, and to use the clash metaphor?
Yes.
And what are the deeper resonances there?
Can I add a footnote to this question? So much of, that conversation about political theology is so interesting because, of course, the genealogy of political theology goes to Carl Schmitt, and so much of the discussion of political theology is so linked to the notion of sovereignty, modern state sovereignty. And so, and really when we do have challenges to that conception of sovereignty, they have to come from, they also need to involve a critique of modernity, the depth of modernity as a project. So already political theology, the concept, is understood in relation to sovereignty, modern nation state sovereignty.
No, thank you. I think I have a broader take as a starting point on political theology. I can see Professor Omer and I are going to have a long conversation about this, and no doubt I will lose. But there's a sense of pivot, I think, to sovereignty in the state and modernity, which first happens in a conversation within Christian theological frames around governing authority. It's a question that is as ancient as it is modern. And through nationalist discourse, I think it's as primordial as it is modern, in the sense of what resources do traditions bring to bear to the question of governing authority. And so my starting point is not Schmittian. My starting point is resources of a tradition that have thought about governing authority for a very long time. And so a war of political theologies in my own, as my own expression, presupposes that the Orthodox tradition, like other Christian traditions, has grappled with the appropriation of politics and religion as intermingled essences since their birth. And the exercise of power against questions of divine justice are measured and are measurables against which that discourse runs. And there are competing views that I can see playing out here through the words of Orthodox leaders. On the one hand, what I'm associating with religion as archetype, and on the other hand, religion as more of a flexible ideal type. How movable are these concepts? When you read a Council of Constantinople in 1872 about the ecclesiastical association with the nation through the lens of warning, or through the state through the lens of warning. There's something going on there in the 19th century. And so I think literally a war of political theologies would take an ambivalent assumption of political theology itself, the political theologies of inclusion, political theologies of transnationality versus political theologies of more of a partisan nature, and certainly a nationally parochial nature. That my starting point, rightly or wrongly, is that political theologies and the texture of politico-theological discourse is, evidences the full range of outcomes that we're seeing here being played out. Those arguing against Russia don't step out of their tradition in order to do so. Overin would say, in fact, the statement against Ruski Mir declares it to be a heresy, declares it to actually be an outlier to our tradition. And so it's very strong language. Again, as an outsider to it, I'm just respectfully listening, but I'm noting in Orthodoxy, the charge of unorthodoxy is very serious. And to be declaring one of the most serious and largest and most influential patriarchates to be outside of the boundaries of orthodoxy is very strong language. And those that are doing so are drawing on the core resources of their tradition. Does that answer in some way your question?
No, it does, but I was wondering if you have any knowledge about, say, for instance, how the Russian Orthodox Church is supporting this war, or if they are supporting. We don't hear those voices.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a photo opportunity where Putin meets with the Russian
That's a very good
Orthodox
point.
Archbishop.
Yep.
But I don't think we got coverage of that.
Yes. There are resources, particularly the Krotokville article to which I refer, and these will be hyperlinked in a future article on the CM site, I think, that take a more detailed look at what they perceive to be this movement from about 2005-06 under Patriarch Kirill into the present day, this sort of pivot from a muscular presence to more of a hegemonic relationship. And this makes sense to me, looking at the discourse of the president himself and the role that the Russian Orthodox Church plays in sanctioning or opposing that discourse. I think silence speaks there. There have been a minority. There was, I think on March 13, a letter by some 250 Russian Orthodox priests in a population of tens of thousands. So it's a very small minority, and that's the prophetic right on the margins, voicing concerns. And so even in that space, there are those contending with that tradition and saying, actually, no, this is. And so the silent voices within that and the silent sanction of this action seems to me to be significant.
Can I just follow on with that, then the significance in your mind of I don't pretend to understand all the different Orthodox churches in Ukraine, but the significance of the Russian Orthodox leaders in Ukraine who have distanced themselves from Kirill. What does that mean? I mean, it just seems to be, well, it seems to be systematic in a sense to me.
I think so, although Orthodoxy, one could argue one of the strengths of Orthodoxy is its ability to enter the cultural and national ground. And I think this is where we see some diversities and reimaginings. 2018 is when the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is given official sanction within Orthodoxy. One of the precipitating factors of that wasn't just geopolitical at the high level, but also on the ground, where Russian Orthodox priests were not burying and giving appropriate rights to Ukrainian soldiers in the East. Now, this was a pastoral, theologically derived point of outrage. It's not the only driver to the creation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but I think that's a very significant factor because the ritualization of the resistance can be in some way started there. I think too that and I'm yet to do more work on this, but there's a lot of discourse about mothers. What would your mothers do in heaven if they saw you doing this? And it's a very evocative language of the hereafter. What would your forebears embodied in your mothers and by implication, mother nations treat you? How will they treat you in the afterlife? And so this sort of transcendent quality in the discourses of dissent. Volodymyr Zelensky uses this when he appeals to Russian mothers and their consideration of sons. That actually feeds into the theological discourse, the earlier discourse about how would mothers regard their sons in heaven. And so again, this sort of porous boundary between the temporal and the transcendent. So this theologically derived space, I think, allows us to enter into new formations rather than schisms, I think, but certainly the schismatic nature of what's happening in the Orthodox world itself. Pope Francis, very strong advocacy for Patriarch Bartolome, for example. And so those watching the ecclesiastical world and all the politics that goes with that, that's an international relations all of its own, have some study to do moving forward, because I think a lot will be about to change there.
John, you were in response to Ibrahim's question about political theology. You said, well, I'm not going to Schmidt as a starting point. But you then said that in the tradition, there are other kind of alternative ways of thinking about, you use the word of governing authorities, but the very language of the kind of the alternative language of inclusion, pluralism, toleration, even the civil society, like the Symphonia was the civil society. Those are modern concepts.
They are.
So I mean, so there is an argument here to, but you say, well, they are going to tradition, they argue from within tradition, and my theoretical interest is to see, you know, the kind of the elasticity and historicity of how tradition comes, you know, comes into the space and the contestation. So yeah.
Sorry if I may add to that question. So, you know, the Schmittian idea. So we have a colleague here who's retired now, Fred Dahlmeier. Fred said he went out once to go meet Schmitt, and he spent the whole day with Schmitt. And he asked Schmitt the question, I want to talk about this friend-enemy concept. And he said, Schmitt just said, no, I don't want to discuss that. Because Fred has since adopted the position as opposed to sovereignty. He thinks that if we want really to have a different way of organizing human relations and between states, we must have solidarity. So he's been big on the question of solidarity and opposed to the question of sovereignty, because I think this question of sovereignty is at the root of this. I mean, I can think of the Iran-Iraq war, that there's lots of parallels there about, you know, what that did. Already mentioned the Iraq war, United States and so on. So I think, and some of your comments about, you know, tradition being deployed to outlaw one version. South Africa comes to mind, for instance, you know, apartheid is heresy after the Kairos Declaration, where all the churches came together. And then there was some courage in at least the black church, the colored church could then issue a declaration that apartheid is heresy, that finally the white church had to also adopt in one way or the other.
I think these issues allow me to acknowledge, say as someone who's drawn to ethno-symbolic theories of nationalism, that the modern and the nomenclature of the modern has its place. In fact, it has to, in a way, to, you know, even as a hermeneutical transfer. So,
and the secular, because they're talking about democracy,
yes,
democracy.
Yeah. So even the language of civil society, but this is where I pick up Keane, because, you know, originally civil society was deemed to be a conservative idea. You know, that's what liberal atomists believed was a good space, a highly idealized space. But Keane comes in from a post-secular orientation, from a critical perspective, and says, no, actually, it has its place as an idea because it's a realm of contestation. It has seeded within it the potentialities always for peacemaking, not just for dislocation, for collectivities. I think that parallels my approach to a realm such as political theology. And so there's an innately modern engagement that has to occur. But why I default to something like governing authority is that solidarity movements in the end will have to progress towards some sort of understanding of governance. And so the role of governance in the exercising of power is as much part of the prophetic challenge, I think, as those who are already embedded in institutions. Those outside of them, thinking about reconceptions, cannot but be confronted by the challenge of what does governance look like? How does it operate? How is power mediated between others? And I can see the texture of this grappling happening in the discourses of orthodoxy. And what's interesting to me is that that discourse is occurring back into the Russian space from a dissenting church. It actually hasn't gone east to west, it's gone west to east theologically, geopolitically, because it's the same theological universe that they're contending with. And I think that there's an outworking there that I see in other traditions constantly, and that we see in a variety of faith communities constantly, just your average conversations about what do you think should happen at that popular level. The variety of views are on show, but they are views that can occur within the same bounded theological community. I just don't see how we can get away from that.
Maybe just a final question about the fact that Zelensky is Jewish.
Absolutely. The statement of the interfaith statement in Odessa last week was, I think, again, trying to model the civil society front of voices of faith, tradition, and culture. And so, absolutely, I think that this pivot towards inclusion is the core challenge for, just say, Ukraine is victorious and we get a muscular religio-nationalism coming out of Ukraine, that pivot, which can now occur, might not have occurred too soon. And so I think what Father Overon, the consequences of what Father Overon is seeding here is for the dominant religious and cultural group to cede to the national collective, which, under the leadership of their Jewish president. And so the civic and the civil does, in a thicker liberal sense, become emergent. I think what I'm trying to grapple with is that thinner sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so interesting because, of course, there are also like absences in Ukraine of all the Jews who have been there and are not there. And so I think this is a really interesting dimension, a twist to this ongoing story. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.